Okay, I think we should start now. Can you hear me? So, dear ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to the online course on East Caucasian languages organized by the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory of the HSC University, Moscow, Russia. My name is Anastasia Yakovleva. I'm a research assistant in the lab and the moderator of today's session. Today is the fifth lecture in the series of 9, and it is entitled Directionality in East Caucasian Languages. It will be given by a leading research fellow, Professor Michael Daniel. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to clarify some organizational issues. As usual, each lecture will be recorded, live streamed on YouTube, and stored there afterwards. The lectures will go uninterrupted, followed by a question period. Those of you who are joining the lecture via Zoom will be muted throughout the session in the interest of the lecturer and sound quality. You may send your questions via the Zoom chat or YouTube live chat. At the end of the talk, I will read selected questions out loud for the speaker to answer them. It is my pleasure now to introduce Michael Daniel, leading research fellow of the Linguistic Convergence Lab and professor of the School of Linguistics of the HSC University in Moscow, Russia. He has diverse research interests, including linguistic typology, the grammar of Dagestanian languages, social linguistics, and linguistic anthropology. He has performed extensive field work on a number of Dagestanian languages and co-edited a book on Mehweb, an East Caucasian language belonging to the Dargwa group. He's the author of multiple publications and book chapters in the fields of morphology, grammatical semantics, and multilingualism. In such high-profile journals as Language, International Journal of Bilingualism, Language Sciences, Linguistics, Language Variation and Change. He also co-edited several books. The most recent of them is the Mouton de Gruyter Number in the Words Languages, forthcoming in 2022. So, Michael, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Nastya, for this kind of introduction. I hope you can hear me, and now we'll see whether you can see my screen. Yes. Okay, good. Thank you, Garik, for this nice hint. No, it doesn't work. Yeah, okay, it works now. So before I proceed, I just have to confess that shortly before the time of this lecture, I have discovered that my keynote automatically changed all latives to natives, all allatives to relatives, and all essives to sessile for some reason. So if you see any, I try to take care of this, but if you see anything, you can meow or moo or whatever, produce whatever sound you want. So this is, in a sense, continuation of last year's lecture on spatiality in East Caucasian languages. We're going to go along this road. I'm not sure we're going to reach the fourth point here, but I hope so. I will start with a very short, quick recap of the introduction last year, so that especially those of you who could not attend last year's school just could see where we stand right now. This lecture, of course, is a very kind of general survey of the field without very detailed insight in the topic. It's a survey lecture. Okay, so a quick recap of spatial forms from last year. You might remember this picture. Let me try to switch off. Yeah, that's better. So this picture describes a typical motion event. You have a bee that moves from under a stone. And it has several components. You have a landmark, the stone, sometimes called also ground. You have spatial domain, or sometimes orientation, in some traditions defined with respect to this landmark. You have the event itself, motion from this spatial domain, and you have a trajectory figure, which is B. And in Archie, a Lesbic language of the East Caucasian family, this event is described without mentioning the trajectory itself, is described by one single word form on the left, cseletlis, from under the stone. The structure is amazingly similar, actually, to the structures of languages like Russian and English, with the proviso that in English and Russian corresponds to the so-called complex preposition, the only obvious difference is the order of the elements. You have the landmark designation coming first, and then localization and direction, localization under and direction from is expressed by suffixes, while in Russian and English, the mirror order is used with the direction expressed by the first kind of prefixed element, whatever, however you want to call it. And localization comes next and closer to the designation of the landmark. So basically, the structure in Archie looks very similar to the structure in Russian and English. And then what, apart from morpheme order, makes this Caucasian special in terms of expression of the spatial events? There's an eternal problem of distinguishing between spatial and spatial when you talk about spatiality in East Caucasian, but I'll try to deal with this. First of all, the spatial notions are expressed by morphologically bound elements, affixes rather than function words, for those people who believe in difference between affixes and function words in the first place. I do. And on the other hand, on top of it, you have a very regular meaning form mapping. So you don't see cumulation. Same affixes are responsible for the same components, for the same elements of spatial meaning. The morphological structures look much more compositional in a sense than prepositional constructions in Russian or English. That has been discussed many times. This idea of more clear compositionality of the structures, like starting from Kibrik 1970, then by Yakov Tistelets in 1980, which has been later reworked. I'm referring to this research as 1980, which is his, I think, diploma study, but it has been reworked and enlarged lately in the 2000 or was slightly shortly after. So if you look at the structure of the spatial paradigm, you see that the spatial forms of Archie not only are at least shown here as affixes, but also show much more, seem to show a more straightforward correspondence between the combination of the spatial domain designation, like inside, inter, between something, sub, under something, and the meanings of related to the motion event itself, like static location, motion towards, motion from, then do English forms. By the way, a very similar slide was in last year's lecture, but I think that I have corrected it. There have been some nested typos in it. This one is better. This day's focus is on the difference between lative, elative, directive meanings. So on the category of directionality, today's focus is on this category. And this is why Nach languages and UD, where spatial forms, at least not clearly form any kind of compositional structures, are excluded from consideration today. Though different analyses have been suggested also for some Nach languages, as far as I know. A very small, short terminological note, the difference between this first morphological slot and second morphological slot have been described in a variety of ways, sometimes very contradictory, contradictory with kind of terms competing. It's the same term competing for different slots in the sense. You see that in Kubrick 1970, he calls this spatial domain ориентирующее значение, so uses this idea of orienting something. But then in many publications from his school, the other category, the second slot, so the motion event, has been described as orientation. And the second slot, of which I'm going to talk today, has received also a number of different designations. I will be using a localization for the first slot for the designation of spatial domain, like under or in. And I will be using the term directionality for the second slot, for the slot which is responsible for describing motion or absence of motion. Okay, so that was a quick recap. In the first part, I'm going to try to look at the inventories of directional meanings and to understand what kind of systems they form across languages. And can we say something about this system? Can we just generalize this in some way? The meanings that have been suggested here for directionality values, so the directionality values include, first of all, as if. So I'm here and below. I hope I consistently differentiate between semantic concepts like place, goal, and source, and their linguistic encoding. I use, for semantic concepts, I use a capitalized word, and for language-specific encoding, I use an all small letter term. So you have meanings like place, sleep in the bed, goal, go to the field, source, come back from the woods, path, climb through the window, and then come some more or less peculiar meanings, not so much discussed in the literature. Of course, they are discussed for some at some length in some surveys, but they are less attention obviously is paid to them. Apparently, is paid to them in typological literature. Directive, which is kind of orientation to words like head for the woods or point your gun at someone, and terminative, which does not have a very established term for this, so limit up to a certain point, like go as far as the river. There are also additional meanings discussed in by Alexander Kubrick and Yakov Tistelets in their surveys, but they are more peripheral for me. I might mention them occasionally, but I won't focus on them at least. And also, I won't focus too much on the terminative meaning. Okay, so here again, there is some kind, the terminology is not exactly established for East Caucasian languages. Different authors, and sometimes the same author, used different terms for the same meanings, for the same value of directionality. For instance, in this first kind of establishing the domain, the seminal paper that established the domain of the study of spatial meanings in East Caucasian, Kubrick 1970. he calls the first the central meaning place. He says locative and adds or essive. So he is not very sure yet about how he's going to call it in the future. Later he stayed with the essive term. But for instance, if we're trying to look at the source meaning, it has been described. It has been either designated as allative in most studies, but also as ablative in Comrie and Polinsky. And what Kubrick calls lative has been referred to as allative in Comrie and Polinsky. And maybe the most problematic term is the one which is used for the orientation, so hat for the woods, because it has been used as allative by Kubrick and Distillets, but as versative in Comrie and Polinsky. And to add to the confusion, I suggest to call it directive in this, at least in this paper, though this is not this is a pretty recent kind of term for this category, and I would like it to be established here because I think it's in a sense it does not have some minuses connected to versative and allative, but I do not insist on this term. So let's say it's these slides. It's not the final truth for the in terms of terminology. Okay, so before we proceed to the systems of directionality, I must mention, or even confess probably, that the situation is not as neat as I'm going to present it, because there are other functions of directionality markers which do not qualify for me as so some directionality markers function outside the category of directionality. And also there are some other means in these languages, in East Caucasian languages, some other means are also used to express directional meanings. So for instance, the lative suffix is the same morpheme which is used for dative function in Khvarshi, and probably in some other Tezek languages, though I would not give a list here. And a similar situation is observed in Locke. So the same segment is used both for as a lative in spatial subparadigm of the language, and also as a syntactic case dative, also, allative is materially identical to genitive in Dargwa languages, and I do not know whether this is that might be coincidence, but of course we know that both evolution of allative from genitive and dative from lative are commonplace in diachronic typology. These are very usual grammaticalization paths. Directive, for instance, in Sahur, can be attached directly to the nominal stem and then express apparently the same meaning, motion towards a landmark. But it is the use of the same suffix outside the spatial subparadigm, because in a spatial subparadigm, the directive, the marker that I call directive, needs to follow a localization marker. And this specific marker in Sahur can be also attached both after the localization marker and immediately after the nominal stem, oblique stem. Maybe more interestingly, lative or directive, so some meaning connected with the either orientation or goal, are homophonous with converb or adverbializer, or what has come to be called functive in typology. So functive is a category which describes constructions like he took her as a wife in a function of the wife. This is at least less expected. I don't know how common is this link, diachronic link or functional link between the meanings cross-linguistically, but that has been recently discussed for Agul and Rutul and Archie, and you see that the markers here are not, even though the languages are related, they belong to the same branch of East Caucasian, the markers do not look like they're cognate. And finally, there is another, as Johanna last time put it, quirk of Dargwa languages, which use acid, which use a class agreement, to convey the acid meaning. So these are other functions of directionality markers, but also sometimes other means which do not form part of the directionality category are used to express directional meaning. For instance, a special directive element hin in Chamalal is used to express direction, but it does not make a formal part. It is not one of the values of directionality category. It is not aligned with the other directional meanings into the same paradigm. Similar, maybe a slightly more complex situation is in Tabasaran for directive translative D. And we have dative used for goal. Sorry, here it's not capitalized. It should be, for consistency, it has to be capitalized, goal. So goal may be expressed with some nouns by a dative, so syntactic case, which does not make part of the inventory of the category of directionality. In Lesbian, Agul, and Unudi, but I promise not to talk about Udi today, so it's not here on the slide. It's important to see the difference here. So I just mentioned that in some Cesic languages and in Locke, the same marker is used to express both the dative syntactic function and is used for goal within the spatial subparadigm. This is not the case in Lesbian in Agul. They have their own goal marking within the spatial subparadigm. So the difference is that in Huarshi and Locke, the dative suffix is also used as a lative suffix in spatial subparadigm. While in Lesbian in Agul, the dative as a syntactic case is used with some nouns to express goal. So there is a superficial similarity between the situations, but they are essentially very different patterns. Okay, so if we now try to look at what kind of combinations of these categories we see, in this representation, at least on this slide, there are no obvious patterns. It looks like, okay, we all have acid. We also all have, all languages also have an allative category, but the presence of lative, directive, terminative do not seem to form a clear pattern. Even across related languages like Archi, Sahur, Lesbian, and Rutul, sometimes pretty closely related like Rutul and Sahur, there is a variation. So instead of just looking at the inventors of the labels suggested by the grammars, one should probably follow the path that first was suggested by Kibrik 1970 and look at mergers of the function. So he was considering kind of neutralizations of directional meanings. What kind of directional meanings meet in the same marker? So what I call mergers here. And also something that I don't think he paid attention to because he had very different interests, gaps. So what kind of directional meanings may stay in specific systems, may stay outside the category of directionality. So they may be expressed by some other means, but they do not form part of the category of directionality. I don't think that Kibrik 97 had this kind of focus. So the full system looks like this. You have different meanings, directional goal, place, source, path. And they all correspond to its own marker within the system of directionality. And these full systems are observed. I think that we have just seen that this system is represented, for instance, by Archie in the description by Alexander Kibrik. So this is kind of full system. But now, what can be merged here? And here we see a very clear pattern. What are the patterns of mergers and gaps in this system? So a preliminary overview of this systems gives the following picture. Goal and place merge into one marking pretty often. There is a recurrent merger of source with path, or at least the source marker in traditional grammars called allative also express path, so is used instead of absent translative. Okay, and also direction, so what I call directive, or path, which is commonly called translative, are values which may be missing from the system of directional meanings. So it may go outside, for instance, in Tabasaran, the marker which is responsible for path does not make exactly the same. It's a morphological marker, but it doesn't make part of the same category of directionality. It's not aligned with them into the same inflectional category. For Chamalal, I already mentioned that the marker hin for directive also lies outside the system of directional markers, according to Bakarev. So what we see here are very frequent merger of goal and place, probably less frequent and but still pretty much visible merger of source and path. Although I think that this has to be controlled for the types of context where it occurs. And then also path and direction may leave the system altogether. Next slide, preliminary again, shows what kind of events, what kind of things cannot happen to directional systems in East Caucasian. So what obviously does not happen is a co-expression of place and source. Kibrik mentions one case, but in his survey, but also only as a typological background, and I have not been able yet to check it. He gives an example from Nif dialects, and we have to look more closely at this because this is a very uncommon co-expression, place and source. Path also cannot be expressed with place. Direction. There is a small problem here because direction and goal are pretty close meanings. We can define them so that we think we know that we're dealing with two different semantic concepts, but in actual life, it's not very easy to distinguish between direction and goal. So I cannot exclude that in the systems where goal and place are merged together, this form may also, in some contexts, express the direction. But my feeling is that direction and goal can be distinguished in a consistent way, and then direction would not go together with place, or even direction and goal probably do not merge together, even though they seem to be conceptually very similar because they include motion towards a landmark. Also, two other important things that we note from this scheme, and which I think hold true for all East Caucasian languages, is that source never leaves the domain of directional meanings. So it always is one of the necessary parts, components of the category of directionality. And goal, while we just have seen that goal may be co-expressed with place in one category, in one formal category, language specific category, it cannot leave the system. So I don't know languages which could not express goal by one of the forms, either by a dedicated form or by a form which combines goal and place. I hope this is clear. I know this is a web of red lines, but I hope I managed to make sense of them here. Good. So just to generalize a little bit here, coming back to what is actually observed, we see that goal, place, and source, in a sense, form the core of this system, and that's exactly the conclusion to which Kubrick 1970 also comes. He says that the central meanings are, he considers these to be central meanings. They may be co-expressed or they may be kept separate, but they are always there in the system. It's interesting to speculate, it would be interesting to speculate why goal and place come together so often. It might be a resultant state metaphor, because if you have a verb of motion towards a landmark, then the resultant state of the situation is staying at the location, which may make this goal and place more similar to each other. Of course, you can ask why source is not co-expressed with place in this situation, because in source the initial point, the point of departure, could be responsible for co-expression with place. I think that might be similar to the asymmetry between what is commonly known as resultative prospective asymmetry in verbal semantics. Resultative is a much more central and verbal meaning than prospective, which is less grammaticalized, less part of the system. It's less clear to me why source and path are co-expressed, even though this is a very typologically widespread type of co-expression. We have been discussed this with a colleague of mine, whom many of you know, Dima Ganenkov, and we converged on the idea that this might come from an egocentric metaphor. So when you are laying out a path, you are kind of considering yourself as a starting point of this path. But at least in modern, I mean, in the synchronic situations, the path does not necessarily start at the location of the speaker. This is, by the way, this is also the construction which is very much present in Dagestani and Russian. Dagestanians, when speaking Russian, even as a first language, they use very much things like "пойдем не отсюда, а оттуда," designating the path by the source means. Okay, so the generalizations also derived to a certain extent from Kubrick 1970 research is that any directional system expresses at least three meanings: place, goal, and source. Goal and place may be formally co-expressed while source is always kept apart, and no other meaning seems to be expressed by all directionality. And then I think that the most important type of classification of East Caucasian spatial systems, not spatial systems, sorry, directionality systems, is into two classes: tripartite, where the three core meanings of place, goal, and source are all distinct from each other, and bipartite, where goal and place are merged but kept away from source. And this is shown in the following scheme. I think that the list of languages is pretty correct for this system. So some Lesgic languages split between tripartite and bipartite systems. Andic languages, this is well, Andic languages are not consistent in the sense, we will see that a little bit later, that they combine tripartite and bipartite system within the one paradigm. So some localizations distinguish elative, passive, and lative, and some only elative and lative. etc. So I just put, and Hinaluk is obviously bipartite system. Now the question is, strange that it was not here. Yeah, okay, yeah. So there was a small terminological discussion. What should be the terms for these mergers? I missed it. I'm sorry. Just let me get back to this for a split of a second. For the merger, there are no good terms. Just to start with, I have no very good ideas. But for Rutul, on which we're working now, we have been using the word locative for a neutralization between goal and place, for co-expression of goal and place. Not a very good idea, of course, but that's a kind of very general term which may cover different meanings. That's why we used it. And I noticed that Gillotier, in his discussion of Chris, I think, also uses the same term for a merger of goal and place. Even worse is the situation for the merger of source and path. I was unable to come up with anything very good. Maybe ablative would be good here, because we know very well that latent ablative is also, well, we don't know very well, but I think I remember that latent ablative might also be used as path, but correct me if I'm wrong. So in a sense, ablative is also a very general term which could be used for a combination of source and path meaning. But again, as I said, the combination of source and path in one marking is much less clear and much less studied than the combination of goal and place. And maybe we should just wait for more empirical data on the uses in which source may be used as path. Okay, let me get back here. Of course, one can ask whether further merger is possible. And it's not possible in East Caucasian languages. So elative and locative, the source never merges with place and goal, as I said. But interestingly, there is a paper by Tanya Nikitina on the Manda language where there's a full merge. No morphological distinction, or no formal distinction is made between source, place, and goal. They all combine in one postposition, which only specifies the spatial configuration. No East Caucasian language, to my knowledge, comes to this situation, even though in some cases, Kina Rutul, or maybe more widely Rutul, comes pretty close to this, because in some of the forms, the only difference between, so Rutul is a bipartite system, not distinguishing between place and goal at all. But in some cases, it also, the difference between what I call locative here and elative is limited to the length of the last vowel, a. And this is a problem because outside the context, speakers often are not able to identify a form as locative or elative, but they are fine with the context, okay? Systemically, at least, we do not know of any language which would merge all three meanings. Okay, of course, there are cases, a further complication is that there are cases in flux. So there is change going on in some part of the directional paradigm with some localizations or with all localizations. For instance, for avar, it has been noticed that in most series, source tends to neutralize with path, one of the neutralizations we have discussed. For Bottlich, two markers are used for path, and one also shows translative uses. So these cases correspond. Importantly, however, these cases in flux can be easily attributed to one of the two mergers that we have seen before. So either merger of translative and source, or like shown here, or merger of goal and place, like in case of discussion by Gillotier of Alik Kris as opposed to other Kris dialects. For Lesgian, where Dmitry Ganenkov suggests that the main most goal meanings are co-expressed with place, but there are very special constrained types of meanings which are expressed by a special marker. And also that has been suggested for Hinu. Okay, so there are cases in flux, but importantly, these mergers should not be confused with certain semantic effects of the systems. All East Caucasian language, except one only branch, use the essive forms with verbs like put, hide, sit. So generally posture, change of posture verbs and position, verbs of positioning, objects. Dargwa here uses lative. Of course, this is only visible in languages with tripartite systems, because languages with bipartite systems like Rutul do not distinguish place and goal in the first place. But once you look at a language which is a tripartite like Archie, you immediately see that where a Russian, or probably not so much English actually, a Russian ear would expect a directional meaning of some kind of lative or goal meaning, Archie speakers use essive. So sit down on the chair on the right. Literally sit down on the chair, not onto the chair, but on the chair. There has been a recent study by Kostya Filatov based on biblical translations of posture verbs, and for more typological background on this phenomenon, see Zaika 2016. So does this mean an ongoing merger of the essive and lative into the locative? I would say no, because the basic verbs of motion, like go or throw, continue to distinguish between place and goal, even in this language, you know, these languages in a very consistent way. So there is something about semantics of these verbs rather than about the semantics of the essive and lative markers. It is not the case that the essive in these languages expresses place and goal, like in the previous cases in flux that we discussed for avar, etc. But verbs of posture combined with place rather than goal. And these two cases should be kept separately when we think about neutralizations. Okay, so end of part 2, takeaway, up to 5 different values, only source, place, and goal expressed in all languages within the system of directionality. Goal often merges with place, producing bipartite systems. Translative sometimes merges with elative, though more research is needed here. And it is not very clear and much more subtle tests needed whether directive can be merged with lative or is kept apart. Good. Part 2. I think I'll go and grab my phone to see how I'm doing in terms of time. I'm sorry. Yes, okay. Sorry for this. So let's now look at one specific case. This is a system of spatial forms, spatial subparadigms, so to speak, of a language of Dargwa branch, Mehweb Dargwa. So we see here different markers for which are commonly glossed as essive, lative, elative, and translative. And this appears to be a tripartite system because the system distinguishes between place, goal, and source. But amazingly, unlike all other East Caucasian language branches that we have seen before as tripartite, the lative is unmarked. You see that che, which is a marker of the super location, so on something, is present in all in the whole line, but the lative meaning is expressed by apparently by a 0. There is nothing added to this. While the essive, as I mentioned before, several minutes ago, is expressed by the presence of b, which is one of the class markers. So if that would be a form agreeing with a masculine class, it would be chev. So it looks like, so this table shows that the essive forms is distinct from lative forms. but only in the presence of agreement. And this is kind of problematic. First of all, essive is marked and lative is unmarked, and this is not very common. It never happens in other East Caucasian languages, but it's also not very common typologically. So here you see the example. On the bridge contains the class marker position. Onto the bridge does not contain anything, just plain localization marker. And from the bridge, sorry for the typo here. That's another, by the way, automatic change that my keynotes does. For some reason, it changes the right parenthesis into a 0. Don't know why. Here you see la, which is an relative marker. Also, place as opposed to goal is expressed by the presence of agreement slot, which is also not very clear, because of course we know, people who have worked on East Caucasian spatial forms know that many, or just in nominal morphology, know that many nominal forms do contain an agreement slot. But this is, to my knowledge, the only case in East Caucasian where the whole meaning is expressed by the presence of agreement slot. So this is something different from the case, for instance, lak or avar, or elatives from Dargwa itself, where the elative contains, there is a material, a morpheme, which is elative marker, and it contains inside it an agreement slot. So the morpheme agrees in gender. But this is not the case here, because here we only have, all we have here as an expression of essive, all we have here is agreement marker. So let's make a very naive thing first. Let's turn a blind eye on the presence of the class agreement marker in this form. Let's pretend it's not there. Then we have traveled from a very unusual tripartite system with a goal unmarked, place marked only by the presence of the agreement marker, to a bipartite system, which is pretty common in East Caucasian. You have a locative, what I suggested to call locative above, which is unmarked. This is che. Again, remember that we do not see this class agreement position. And we have a marked elative. So it's very similar to what you have in Rutul and in many other bipartite languages, in all other bipartite languages. Okay, but why should we turn a blind eye on this? So how could we motivate this kind of solution? This is what results from this consideration. Dargwa is a bipartite system, one that does not distinguish between place and goal. Ouch, relative systems. It's elative systems. It's locative versus elative systems. Sorry. Okay, so my suggestion is to try and change the perspective from saying that agreement slot is a morpheme expressing the essive meaning. So the interpretation here, the common interpretation, I think this is a more or less common approach in Dargwa linguistics. Agreement as a marker of the essive category. I suggest to say that the form expressing place, when it expresses place, agrees, while the form, the locative form which expresses goal does not agree. So agreement is a morphosyntactic property of the use of the locative form in a context when it encodes place. Okay, even if you followed me so far, you question why should we change the perspective here? Why does, if we consider this as on this slide, if we admit that Dargwa is a bipartite system with a locative versus elative, why should the locative form agree when it encodes place, but does not agree with when it encodes goal? So what do we know about East Caucasian agreement in general? I think that the most discussed property of East Caucasian agreement is very unexpected targets in the clause. So it's not only verb, like in quite a few other languages, but not so many actually, but also adverbs, locative forms, particles, elements which do not show a direct syntactic connection to the controller of agreement. So this is something that I will provisionally call clausal agreement. Interestingly, among noun phrases, arguments on the whole are less likely targets than adjuncts. There are some exceptions. Like in Archie, for instance, the personal pronouns of the first person do agree in gender in the dative, but not in other forms. But in general, it seems that this is a tendency. So arguments are, on the whole, less likely targets than adjuncts. For instance, in endic, an x-directional case, which used to contain an agreement infix, then extended its use to the domain of experiential uses, so more syntactic ones. And in quite a few endic languages, this class marker has been frozen. So the hypothesis here is that in East Caucasian, clausal agreement serves as a means of syntactic coherence. And because adjuncts are less integrated with the core of the clause, kind of less, in formal terms, they are less predictable by the semantics of the verb. I a little bit reluctant to draw a solid line between arguments and adjuncts, but it's more or less clear that yeah. So I would probably prefer to talk in terms of more or less strong co-integration with the verb. So adjuncts are less integrated with the core, and thus require agreement as a means to support syntactic coherence, more than arguments, because they are more integrated with the verb anyway. So why then in Dargwa the locative form agrees when it encodes place, but not when it encodes goal? Because goal is much more integrated with the semantic of the verb. So you can't use really use a goal NP without an event of motion. An event of motion is encoded by the lexical semantics of the verb, while the place is combinable with virtually all types, or most types. It's much less constrained by the verbal semantics. So my conclusion here is that goal is more closely integrated with the semantics of the verb. So it's more argument-like, if you want, and place is less, more adjunct-like. And this is why in Dargwa, place does agree in gender and goal does not agree in gender. But the form is the same. It's the same locative form, which behaves differently morphosyntactically in different contexts. So a good test for this could be the use of place and argument position. But that's, as I said, it's hard to find. However, in the previous part of the lecture, we have seen that posture verbs take place in East Caucasian and not goal. So this is a good test for Dargwa to see what happens in Dargwa. Posture verbs take place in East Caucasian, and place with posture verbs is kind of like an argument in a sense. It's much more required by the if I'm putting something on the table, or if I'm sitting on a chair, sitting down onto a chair, then it's much more argument-like than just a random adjunct. Good. So it would be interesting to see what happens to posture verbs in East Caucasian. But wait, we just have seen that Dargwa is the only exception from the East Caucasian languages. So one branch, and this is specifically Dargwa, which uses lative with posture verbs. Now let's see, what does it mean that Dargwa uses lative with posture verbs from this new from the suggested interpretation of Dargwa nominal morphology? Under this interpretation, there is no essive and there is no lative. There is a locative form. And so what happens is that Dargwa posture verbs take their place without agreement marking. And that's exactly what we would expect if the interpretation is of presence of or absence of agreement is correct. So we have a usual situation where place is an adjunct and then it agrees in gender. We also have a very usual situation where goal is an argument and then it does not agree with gender. And then we can say that the arguments of the change of posture verbs are in fact placed like in all other East Caucasian languages, but they do not agree because they are more argument-like. So we either can say that Dargwa posture verbs take place argument, but because it is an argument, the locative form does not agree, or else we have just to admit that Dargwa languages are once again different from all sister branches. And I guess you know what my preference is here. So then the reinterpretation of the Dargwa system is from the tripartite system, the usual one in Dargwa grammars, to the bipartite system with a special property of the locative form, morphosyntactic property of agreeing or not agreeing, depending on the morphosyntactic context where they're used. So the takeaway from this story is that reinterpretation of the Dargwa system of directionality allows us aligning Dargwa languages with the rest of the family in a better way than they have been aligned, than they apparently are aligned. So from a weird tripartite system to the regular bipartite systems, verbs of change of posture and the like behave exactly the same as in other languages of the branches of the family. Of course, there is also a price to pay. We need to accept some assumptions about the role of agreement in East Caucasian languages. Luckily, that they are also, to my mind or to my mindset, also supported by other properties of agreement systems. But of course, all this argumentation that have been deployed in this part of the lecture is only functional in case you share these types of assumption about the agreement in East Caucasian. And this is highly debatable. Okay, part 3. Hope I'll do it. So I have argued above that two properties distinguish East Caucasian spatial forms from complex prepositions, which are formal regularity and boundedness. So kind of they look like inflection. Indeed, we have seen this this picture which compares Archie and English, and Archie seems much more inflection-like, even if we forget about much more regular and transparent than spatial forms of English. But formal regularity can be disputed because some systems look much less regular than the Archie system. Like this one. On the right, you have Bagwalal, an Andic language, and all of a sudden, so it looks like a bipartite system, only distinguishing between locative, and elative. But all of a sudden, in one and only one localization, it does distinguish between the essive and lative, and that's why, in the first place, the two colons are distinguished. This is unpredictable. Why? Synchronically unpredictable, or even worse, Kina Rutul and some other Rutul dialects. You have certainly a bipartite system with a distinction between locative. Here it's a typo for sure, locative versus elative. But the difference is rendered by the vowel quantity here, by la in other cases. And all of a sudden, you also have khda in sub-essive, which is not preserved in elative, so it's not a nice, clear, neat picture as in other languages. So Maybe the idea that there is a full regularity and transparency of inflection was idealization of East Caucasian languages. On the upside, the idea that there's some unpredictable positions in the paradigm kind of confirms their bounded status, because selectivity excludes, as we know from the studies theoretical works on clitics, selectivity excludes the clitic analysis. Good. Is the clitic analysis indeed excluded? Let's see. Let's look at this further fact. Thank you. Okay. So in addition to spatial forms of nouns with which we dealt so far, East Caucasian languages also have other lexical classes, which also take directional suffixes. This includes spatial adverbs, spatial postpositions, local place names, behave as kind of locational nouns rather than simple nouns, body part locations. So mkha is not a noun. It's a stem which can only take directional markers. Also, body part locations. He had a rifle in his hands. The word kodi in Tukita is not a noun. The noun for hand, I think it's rela. I'm not very sure. It's a separate lexical item. This is a kind of, well, usually people call them adverbs, spatial adverb. Also, some languages also have verbal forms which may take directional endings, like achi form, where it stopped. This is a locative converb. So all these forms and lexical items may take directional suffixes. This is example from directional suffixes from Meweb. So this sounds like a cross-categorial element. So should we consider directionality markers as cross-categorial clitics? They are attached to so many different types of lexical units, lexical items, that they do look like cross-categorial clitics. But fortunately, we just have seen this data from selectivity. So at least in some languages, at least some directional markers may be selective. And this is anything but a clitic behavior. So what is the alternative solution for this? An alternative solution is that all this wide list of elements belong to the same morphosyntactic category if you want a part of speech category of its own, spatial words. Let's call them spatials for short. And while So while spatial adverbs, local place names, and body part locations are primary spatials, locative the marker of the locative converb ha and the localization markers here act as specializers. So they turn something else, a verb or a noun, into a spatial word, into a spatial. And this is in line. We know that there is some kind of derivation like that, discussed by Haspermat back in 1996. Regular derivation of another regular transposition of a lexical item into a different part of speech. So I prefer the solution which does not say that elements, that the directional markers are clitics because they are cross-categorial, but the solution that says that this is a separate part of speech, which have the same type of inflection. So they are selective. First of all, they attach to a special part of speech, which is called spatials. They are also selective, so the directionality is inflection. Also, they are bound. The question is, to what extent they are bound? And here in the few time that is left, I just wanted to show you several examples which show a certain degree of variation in this sense. Look at this example, for instance. Literally, it says he went to the Georgian, to his house. Here you have a locative ma, not followed by any directional marker. And then comes the noun notlak, to the house. So literally it says, at Georgian place, he went into the house. It sounds perfect in English because it kind of, you can first indicate a general areas in space where the event is deploying, and then you more directly indicate what type of motion event happens. So kind of when he was at Georgian's place, he went into the house. The problem is, however, that as I will show in a few slides, this seems to be a kind of a one constituent. So unlike what you would expect from this English-like analysis, at Georgian's place, he went into the house, these elements are linked. They cannot be separated by additional material. Similar examples come from Godeberi, literally at mother from the arms. So you would expect here, ilu churu kwaduru. I just, that's my Bagwalal accent. But what you find here is quant, so essive marking, essive encoding on the first noun, and the elative encoding on the second element. Similar example probably comes from Hinnock. I won't stay on this. And maybe most compellingly, again, the data comes from Dargwa languages. So this example literally says, here inside there is smell. Here inside is smell. But if you try to analyze this element separately, then ishtu means not here. You remember that when unmarked, this form is interpreted as a goal and not as place. So if you try to put a comma here, or to just in any way to analyze this element separately, that makes a nonsensical reading. It makes into here, there inside, smell. That doesn't make sense. So the obvious solution here is that the directional marker in this context is a marker which operates on the whole phrase, on the phrase on the whole. Gurjima notlak is an adverbial phrase which attaches a directional marker on the whole. Here also, the full adverbial phrase, the locative adverbial phrase, agrees at its last element because it's in a place, used as a place and not as a direction. And this is supported, at least in some languages, by elicitation, where we try to manipulate with these constructions. So in Mehoet Dargwa, you can say up there on the hill with one marker on the whole adverbial phrase. Whether it's a locative mark, whether it's a locative now adverbial phrase or an elative adverbial phrase. You can also convey the same meaning with both element marked. It's a possible, but then it's these are interpreted as two different separate adverbial phrases. Each of them receives its own marking. But what is unacceptable is if you try to change the order here, because that makes, if you put the agreement which makes this element read as a place, and then followed by an element which does not take an agreement, that is interpreted in the sense like there on the hill towards there, up there. And this is does not make sense. It's an example which is out. Okay. I think that I will go directly to the. I will leave this element, or this discussion of the adverbs and postpositions maybe for the discussion part. And I just wanted to go very briefly to the interpretation. So the empirical part, you have seen it, and it's up to your analysis in a sense. I have my own preferred analysis of this, which is shown on this slide. What is the morphological status of directionality markers? They behave as clitics in the sense that they attach to the full adverbial phrase, right? But on the other hand, we have seen at least some properties which make them not very likely candidates to the clitic status. Like some of them are, sometimes they are selective. They involve sandhi. Some of them are expressed by vowel quantity, sorry, not vowel quality, quantity. So that makes them more like inflection than clitic. But their locus is governed by syntactic rules. So they attach to the element which is on the right periphery of the adverbial phrase. And I think my preferred interpretation of this follows the analysis suggested in Anderson and co-authors, and then discussed at length by Spencer and Lewis in their introduction to clitics handbook, is what they suggest, what they call edge inflection. It's a morphological inflection whose locus is chosen by syntactic rules. So it's an element which formally behaves as a morphological affix. Like it might be selective. It may distinguish between different word classes, etc. But we know which item has to be inflected from the syntax. Okay, of course, this is all this needs more empirical data, because the effect that I have discussed in this part varies across languages and directionality values. In general, it seems that elative is much more clitic-like than lative in those languages which do have it. Now, for instance, in Andi, elative marking can be shared across the legative phrase. So just the only last element is inflected for the elative. But for instance, lative marking cannot. So languages do not behave in a similar way here, and directionality markers do not behave in the same way. And so one of the interpretation here is that, yeah, thank you. One of the suggestion here is actually that this evidence indicates that you remember that in the first part, I have been discussing the issue that different directional markers may make part of the directionality category to different extent. So some of them are thrown away outside into some just a lonely wolf category, so they are not part of the category of directionality, etc. Here, maybe the data that we have discussed also may be interpreted in this way. So not all directionality markers, even those that I have so far consistently considered to be directional markers, members of the category, are members of this category to the same to the same extent. So elatives might be more peripheral than latives, for instance. And there may be a correlation between this edginess of the inflection and the degree to which this may be taken as a token to what extent a directional marker makes part of the directionality category. Good. So takeaway from this is that we have seen that localization markers that we have seen as pure inflection may be considered to be spatializers. So they join the club of other spatial forms, and then localization markers are, in a sense, regular part of speech change in inflection, as Martin discusses in his paper. Some spatials include primary, and some others are derived, like locative converbs and spatial forms of nominals. For some languages, at least, there is evidence that some directional markers some spatial words may combine into adverbial phrases, which in the end take directional inflection as a whole, and probably also, I have to admit, which does not make this presentation much more beautiful, that the source marking of source is probably less bound, more clitic like the marking of goal, and so it's in the end, at the end of the day, it's not very clear to what extent active, locative, and relative forms necessarily form one category. And this is my conclusion. More research on the degree to which directional markers form one homogeneous category is needed, and more empirical data here. Thank you so much. I'm done. That's all for today.
Thank you very much. And now we should go to the questions. We should proceed to the questions.
I should stop sharing, right?
Yes. Now I will share my screen.
Yeah.
With the questions that we have. Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, here are the questions. Okay, should I read them, or you will prefer to read them aloud?
I can see them. Yeah.
Okay.
What is the marker of orientation? I just did not include all prepositions into the slide on English, and towards is pretty much like directive in the other languages. Where in Dargwa is la the relative marker? That's one of the variants of okay, I have to check once again, but I was pretty sure before the presentation that MehWeb uses la as the relative. I'll check. Thank you. Maybe just a kind of insane.
Sorry, I just didn't know about MehWeb, so it's just a question.
Yeah,
Sorry, now I know after you told about MehWeb. Thank you.
I have to check then. If you don't know, I might have make a mistake here. Okay, so Maxim Fedotov asks, взял в жены, пошел в солдаты. Yeah, so yes, that might be. I never thought about this in this way, but it might be. Yeah, it might be a similar thing. Thank you, Maxim. Could you just scroll a little bit to Timur's question? I think you mentioned the tool 9 among relative directive markers, syncretic with as part of the inventory. My memory is that in the examples that I have seen, na probably does not combine with localization forms, but combines directly with the stem. But I might be, maybe there are some other examples also. So if there are, let's discuss them. I thought my memory was that the examples that I've seen, it simply combines with the noun. So it's not directionality marker in this sense. But I again might be wrong. Can the goal place merger be supported by the fact that there are few contexts of ambiguity? Yes, that's the idea, exactly the idea suggested by Tatiana Nikitina. She says that, well, okay, she asked the question, if everything has merged, goal, place, and relative, how on earth the speaker, the addressee would know what is meant? That is deduced from the semantics of the verb, and she has a very nice discussion of how the verb semantic helps to disambiguate between goal, place, and source on top of it, right? And that's, I think, what happens also in sense in Kinaru tool, when there is a very subtle difference in vowel quantity. It is certainly supported by the context. The interpretation of relative versus locative is supported by the context. How might use of directional I have no knowledge of co-expression of spatial markers that we're discussing here, and ergative marking in a typological perspective. And I do not think that that happens in the languages, East Caucasian languages that I know of. Yeah, why not also test whether there will be agreement? Yeah, that's a very natural question. The problem is that leave as lexically specified item for indication, so like in English or in Russian, indication of a place of habitation is not a very cross-linguistically common lexical item. So what you usually have in the languages, East Caucasian languages that I know of, is like life, do, or sit sometimes for live, or simply be. And there, because be does not predict the as if argument, it's not so much argument there. But yeah, it's an obvious path to follow, because live is basically only one verb which has an as if as an argument. But the problem is that so few languages have a lexically specified item for be. I must probably add here that the interpretation that I suggested for Dargwa as if versus lative distinction by morphosyntactic property, I cannot suggest that as a clear synchronic rule. That might be a grammaticalization of a difference, explanation of a diachronic evolution. So here I'm not yet sure. I didn't make up my mind here. So yeah, Timur. Regarding directionality markers as clitics versus suffixes of some superclass, okay. At least for some Dargwa lects, but argue for the latter option, superclass. Let me see. As clitics or suffixes. I probably can't understand what's the difference between the locative cases, locative adverbs, some toponyms, locative verb forms. There are members of one syntactic superclass. I don't know what superclass is. Maybe we just mean the same. I don't know what superclass is, so I can't answer this question. Sorry. I guess there are no. There are some comments.
Yes. Okay. I should check also the chat. Maybe there are other questions here. No. Ora Matushansky has a question, but I think all the participants are muted and you should type it into the chat. Sorry. Yes. And what about the comments?
Yeah, thank you, Camille. It's true that there is also, yes, there is a terminological kind of uncertainty between translative and prolative, because in Uralic languages, translative is, as far as I remember, often used in the terms of what I described, what I referred to above as functive. So yes, there is this problem, and I'm not sure that it helps to solve our question. So Uralists have their own problems with. It's not very clear for a typologist why a functive should be called translative. So I'm not sure it's really very helpful to use their practices here, if I understood well what you meant. Petya, translative, prolative, perlative. Right. Right, that's true. Prolative seems to be the most widely accepted. That's also true. That's also true. I think that in one of the works on East Caucasian, Dima Gunenkov was using exactly prolative as a more neutral typological term than translative. Now I think he uses yeah. Or I've seen your question. Yeah, okay. I'll try to address it. So if I understand correctly, Petya suggests that prolative should be used instead of translative. Personally, I'm not against this, but that would be another major terminological change in the system, which is first kind of complicated by many different practices and also not yet well established. That should be decided, but probably not by myself. Same case means more or less the same basic family of spatial meanings. I'm not sure what the okay, that's have been used as labels for the same case in different. Yeah, right. I think it's very important what Petya says here, more or less the same basic family, because this morning I asked Dima Gunenkov what he thinks about. So as one example, lesbian is described as what I would, well, in my terminology, locative versus directive versus elative by Haspelmath, but as active versus lative versus elative by Kubrick. And so I asked Dima Gunenkov what he thinks, because he worked a lot on lesbian. He said that this is what I have indicated there as a case in flux. It's more like bipartite system with a category which is a very constrained, very specific meaning of the goal. So in a sense, Petya is right, putting probably emphasis on more or less the same basic family of spatial meanings, because I skipped over the possible and very probable differences across the meanings of, for instance, directive in one language and directive in the other language. There was a very rough classification, and this is also somewhere where the first important steps have been made by Kubrick and then by Yakov Tistelets in their surveys, but more empirical research is needed to understand the exact semantic nuancing of the categories across languages. Place source merger, yeah, thank you, and Verbs too. Good. Good. Latin is a famous example of what? I'm not sure example of what, so I can't comment on this. Aigul. There are several verbs of motion that unexpectedly mark goal by SIF. Yeah, there is a discussion of what is called, I think, lative shift in Finnic linguistics and in Uralic linguistics. Petya, thanks. I didn't know that about Latin. Yeah, okay, good. But this is, I would consider this case of lative shift as indeed a change in flux, unlike the posture verbs and change of position verbs, which are a separate class, which may be categorized as kind of place verbs or goal verbs across languages. It might also be that this change of posture verbs, a change of position verbs, serve as a middle ground for this evolution from, for instance, locative elative system to, from the active lative elative system to locative elative system. That's a possibility, but I have not discussed and did not see analysis like this for East Caucasian, at least. Yes, I'm not sure. Yeah, there. I don't know. I unfortunately I don't know Finnish, so I don't know even whether Kede is a noun or a verb. But it's true that in some languages have been described as distinguishing between the goal, which is a kind of you go somewhere implicitly to stay there. For instance, in Portuguese, it has been suggested that two types of goals distinguish between going there and then back again to return for a short time, and going somewhere for good or without any specification. I have not seen this kind of semantics encoded in the nominal morphology in East Caucasian. If my colleagues here know of such cases, that would be interesting. But I don't know of such cases. So go to shop only to come back soon, or go to wood without any specification. I don't know about such distinctions in East Caucasian. Yes. It's true. I just didn't mention that in Russian you have related patterns of variation, and I know Tanya's paper on this. I know that Tanya wrote a paper on this. So you have with some of the verbs that I mentioned, they use exactly the same type of. They show variation. So, for instance, you can say in Russian, and neutrally, you can say положить на стол with a goal encoding, but you also can say, maybe slightly more colloquially, but it's absolutely okay also to say положить на столе. Где ты положил книгу? Я положил на столе. Also, спрятаться is a famous verb. You can спрятаться куда, and you can спрятаться где. So some of the verbs that I mentioned behave here, and I think that this is within the typological line of discussion by Natasha Zaiko. Natasha Zaiko, I think so. I hope so. 2016. Circassion expresses most of its spatial meanings in the verb, can have goal and source marked by the same case. This is right, exactly. I know about last case. I didn't know about circassion. That's has sometimes been described as a motive case. So there is a motion, but it isn't important whether it's a goal or source. I know about this case in last, but I didn't know about circassion. And again, this is not a kind of merger which is observed in East Caucasian, as far as I know. Again. Yeah, preposition sign Tagalog. Nesta, could you go a little bit?
Yeah.
Into, from, on, at, through. I think that we should also look. I don't know nothing about Tagalog at all, but we should look not on, because these meanings, these English translations that you provide, they combine directionality meaning and localization meaning. And so to see whether how Tagalog fits into the picture, we need to see, for instance, that whether in is only in the sense of inside, it's only used like as a place, or also as a goal, etc. So I can't judge from these English translations. Gul's question I can see.
Okay, now it's time to stop. So unfortunately, we cannot cover all the comments and questions. And now I would like to express my gratitude to all the participants and to the lecturers. Thank you so much for this very interesting and inspiring talk, and thank all the participants that you came here. You can ask other questions, I think personally.
I now see Aura's question here. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll answer personally, probably. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for this great talk.
Thank you. Thank you for your presence. And please don't forget to come to the next talk. So should I